The following video is an explanation and overview of the Joseph Smith Papyri and their connection with Mormon scripture. Before elaborating on the papyrus collection and its contents, as well as the Book of Abraham and the relationship between the two, I will begin by presenting a brief history of the papyri as a background for the discussion. Between the years of 1818 and 1822, an Italian archaeologist by the name of Antonio Lobolo, digging in Thebes, Egypt, discovers 11 mummies along with some papyrus scrolls. Between 1822 and 1830, the mummies change hands, ultimately ending up in the United States. In 1833, an American named Michael Chandler is commissioned to sell the collection. He tours the eastern states, displaying and selling the artifacts as he goes. Then in early July of 1835, Chandler arrives with 4 remaining mummies and 2 papyrus scrolls in Kirtland, Ohio, headquarters of the newly established Mormon Church, also known today as the LDS Church. In July of 1835, Joseph Smith, the prophet and founder of Mormonism, reveals that the 2 papyrus scrolls found with the mummies contain the writings, respectively, of the biblical patriarchs Abraham and Joseph. Smith then persuades 2 friends to help purchase Chandler's remaining collection for $2,400. Between July and November of 1835, several loose fragments of papyrus from the outside of the scrolls are pasted onto stiff paper for preservation. There are now 2 scroll cores plus the mounted fragments. During this time, Smith studies the Egyptian writing with his scribes, William W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery, and translates portions of the Abraham Scroll into English. Between 1840 and 1844, the mummies and papyri are exhibited to visitors of Smith's home in Nauvoo, Illinois. In 1842, the Book of Abraham translation is published for the first time in the Mormon Church's periodical, The Times and Seasons, along with 3 partially reconstructed facsimiles of vignettes or illustrations from the papyri, with some interpretive commentary by Smith. All of this will later be canonized in Mormon scripture. After Smith's death in 1844, his mother Lucy Mack Smith retains the artifacts in Nauvoo and frequently displays them to guests. In 1856, Smith's widow Emma sells the collection to a man named Abel Combs. Combs sells the scroll cores and 2 mummies to Wyman's Museum in St. Louis, Missouri, but retains 10 mounted fragments for himself. In 1863, the museum moves to Chicago, Illinois. Then in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroys the museum and its collections. In 1892, Abel Combs dies and bequeaths the surviving mounted papyrus fragments to his servant, Alice Huser. In 1947, Huser's nephew sells the papyrus fragments to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. In 1966, University of Utah Arabic professor Dr. Aziz Ataya, doing research at the museum, learns of the existence of the 10 fragments. These fragments had been assumed by everyone to have been burned in the 1871 fire. The following year, the LDS Church acquires the 10 fragments from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then in 1968, the Church publishes the first photographs of the 10 fragments, plus an 11th fragment found in church archives, in its magazine The Improvement Era. Modern scholars are now able to examine the papyri for the first time. I will now give an overview of the papyrus collection and its contents. Joseph Smith's friend and scribe William W. Phelps wrote the following description of the collection in an 1835 letter. 4 Egyptian mummies were brought here. There were 2 papyrus rolls, besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them. Based on this and other contemporary sources, the papyrus collection consisted of the following components. The first papyrus scroll, which included the original core, plus the outer fragments mounted on paper. This scroll contains what is known as the Book of the Dead belonging to a woman named Tshenmin, which I'll call the Tshenmin Scroll. The second papyrus scroll included the original core, plus the mounted fragments. This scroll contains what is known as the Book of Breathings, belonging to an Egyptian priest named Horus, which I'll call the Horus Scroll. In addition, there were 2 loose sheets of papyrus, which have been identified as belonging to another Book of the Dead connected with someone named Neferirnub. There was a piece of papyrus called a hypocephalus, belonging to a person named Shishonk, and there were 1 or 2 additional loose fragments of papyrus besides. What you see here represents the complete collection. The papyrus fragments shown on the right hand are still in existence, in the possession of the LDS Church. The items shown on the left, including the 2 cores and additional fragments, were likely burned in 1871. As I will now develop further, the two papyrus scrolls, the Tshenmin Scroll and the Horus Scroll, correspond respectively to what Joseph Smith identified as the record of Joseph and the record of Abraham. I will begin with the Tshenmin Scroll, as this is the item with the least to comment on. The first question is, does this papyrus contain anything related to the biblical Abraham or Joseph? The answer is no. This is a sample of a late Book of the Dead, a standard Egyptian funerary text. This one belonged to a deceased woman named Tshenmin, probably one of the mummies. It dates to approximately the 1st century BC, about 2,000 years after Abraham and Joseph. What evidence connects this scroll to what Joseph Smith identified as the record of Joseph? Oliver Cowdery described a few vignettes from Joseph's record in an 1835 letter. In that letter he identified the representation of the Godhead, three yet in one. The serpent represented as walking or formed in a manner to be able to walk, standing in front of and near a female figure, and Enoch's pillar as mentioned in Josephus. As shown here, all three of the vignettes described by Cowdery appear to match vignettes in the existing Tshenmin Scroll fragments. Is it impossible that the burned portion of the Tshenmin Scroll did contain writings by the Hebrew patriarch Joseph? No, it's not impossible. Do we know how much of the scroll is missing? No, but there is some circumstantial evidence that it is minimal. For instance, eyewitness accounts from the 1840s and 50s, including visitors to the Smith home in Nauvoo, refer to only one intact scroll. This is later identified specifically by the Wyman Museum as the Horus Scroll. This suggests that the other core, the Tshenmin core, was minimal or non-existent by the 1840s at least. Plus, all contemporary descriptions of Joseph's record correspond to images in the existing mounted pieces. Having established that the Tshenmin Scroll corresponds to what Joseph Smith called the record of Joseph, let's discuss what that is. The first question is, what is known about the record of Joseph? The answer is very little. Joseph Smith never produced a translation before he died. All we know is that he identified one of the two scrolls as containing, quote, the writings of Joseph of Egypt. Because the book of Joseph was never produced, there is little else to be said about it. So now I will move on to discuss the Book of Breathings belonging to Horus, or the Horus Scroll. Here is a picture of the existing fragments reconstructed into a more or less continuous scroll. It is useful to understand that Egyptian writing is read from right to left. The beginning, or right-hand side of the scroll, is located on the outside of the scroll when the scroll is rolled up. The first question is, does the existing papyrus contain anything related to the biblical Abraham or Joseph? No, this is a sample of a Book of Breathings, a standard Egyptian funerary text buried with deceased persons. This one belonged to a deceased man named Horus, an Egyptian priest, probably one of the mummies. This particular text is one of many copies of the same text from the same period, currently found in various museums. It dates to around the 2nd century BC, again a couple of thousand years after Abraham and Joseph. Is there any way to know what was contained in the lost portion of the scroll, as represented in the blank section shown here? Yes. Though the core of the scroll was likely burned, there are reliable clues about both its content and its approximate length. For instance, the vignette depicted in Facsimile 3, published with the LDS Book of Abraham, would have belonged at the very end of this scroll. This vignette is not found in the existing collection, but the name of Horus is visible in the facsimile, and this is a standard scene normally found at the very end of this type of text. Also, based on other copies of the same text from this period, in 1968 Egyptologist Klaus Baer confirmed that there are 2.5 columns of text known to be missing. He estimated the width of this missing text at about 42 centimeters. With an estimated 16 to 17 centimeters for the vignette, this gives a total of, give or take, 59 centimeters of missing papyrus. Another set of crucial clues verifies the maximum length of the destroyed portion of the scroll. Repeating lacunae. A lacuna is an area of missing papyrus, such as this area shown here in blue. The plural of lacuna is lacunae. A repeating pattern of lacunae of similar size, shape, and distance, as shown here in the image, indicate where a chunk of papyrus was torn or broken away from the scroll while it was still rolled up. The distance between any two consecutive lacunae is a winding length, the length of one layer of papyrus wound all the way around. As a rolled scroll is a type of Archimedean spiral, the winding lengths naturally grow smaller and smaller toward the inside of the scroll in a mathematically regular way. Applying basic mathematical formula to the outer windings, one can calculate the length of the lost interior. A 2010 study by Christopher Smith and Andrew Cook, using measurements taken from the scrolls in LDS Church archives, determined that the missing interior portion of the Horus Scroll could not have been longer than 56 centimeters. This length, 56 centimeters, is just enough space to contain the missing 2.5 columns of text plus the Facsimile 3 vignette, and is within 3 centimeters of Klaus Baer's 1968 estimate for this content. I will now discuss the Book of Abraham and its relationship to the Horus Scroll. The first question is, does the Horus Scroll contain anything related to the LDS Book of Abraham? No. Again, the scroll is a typical sample of a standard Egyptian text dating from about 2 millennia after Abraham. How then do Mormon apologists account for this apparent lack of connection between the Horus Book of Breathing scroll and the text of the Book of Abraham translation? There are a few main defenses as follows. The first general argument is that Joseph Smith didn't translate from this particular scroll. One variation on this argument is that there could have been a third scroll which has since been lost. This is often backed up by an alleged eyewitness account of a much longer scroll. The second general argument is that Joseph Smith did translate the Book of Abraham from this scroll, but from a lost section of the scroll. And the third general argument is that Joseph Smith wasn't actually translating at all when he produced the Book of Abraham, but that the scrolls were merely a means to inspire him to get a divine revelation about Abraham. Let's take the first argument. Joseph Smith didn't translate the Book of Abraham from the Horus Scroll, but rather from some other scroll. The problem with this argument is that solid evidence shows that the Horus Book of Breathing scroll, including existing portions, was what Smith identified as his source for the Book of Abraham. Let's look at some of this evidence in greater detail. The first piece of evidence is the vignette shown in Facsimile 1, mentioned by Abraham himself in the text of the Book of Abraham, and which is visible at the beginning of the Horus Scroll. In Abraham chapter 1 verse 12, Abraham says, "The priests laid violence upon me that they might slay me also, as they did those virgins upon this altar. And that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record." Note the altar highlighted yellow in the graphic. 2 verses later Abraham says, "That you may have an understanding of these gods, I have given you the fashion of them in the figures at the beginning." Again, note the god figures highlighted yellow in the graphic. In his commentary on Facsimile 3 in the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith connects Figure 1 with the Book of Abraham as follows. Figure 1, Abraham sitting upon Pharaoh's throne by the politeness of the king with a crown upon his head. As previously mentioned, Facsimile 3 is a standard Book of Breathings vignette, with the name of Horus visible in the facsimile, that would have come at the very end of the document. Another set of evidence connects the Horus Scroll to the Book of Abraham, the Kirtland Egyptian Papers, or KEP. The KEP, found in the archives of the Mormon Church, are pages of Egyptian translation worksheets, notes about Egyptian characters and Egyptian grammar as understood by Smith, and Book of Abraham translation manuscripts from 1835. They are handwritten by Joseph Smith and his scribes, primarily W. W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery. The left-hand columns of the Abraham translation manuscripts list corresponding Egyptian characters beside the English translations. As shown here in a KEP translation manuscript for Abraham 1, the Egyptian characters correspond to characters from the upper right of the existing Horus Scroll papyrus. In other words, the KEP suggests that the beginning of the Book of Abraham corresponds with the beginning of the Horus Scroll, character for character. The yellow box shown here corresponds to the translation for Abraham chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 18. Apologists hypothesize that these Egyptian characters written in the margin are not from the translation process, but rather are the result of the prophet's friends trying to reverse engineer the Egyptian language, after the fact, on the manuscript. This is possible, if not highly problematic, but significantly, the KEP demonstrate at least that Joseph Smith's scribes, if not Smith himself, believed in 1835 that this particular papyrus was the source of the Book of Abraham translation produced by Joseph Smith. Now let's look at the first variant of the argument, that the Book of Abraham was in a separate third scroll now completely lost. If true, this would violate the eyewitness testimony of Phelps, Cowdery, and others. Phelps, as mentioned earlier, described the collection in a letter to his wife soon after its arrival, saying that, "The last of June 4 Egyptian mummies were brought here. There were 2 papyrus rolls besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them." Oliver Cowdery described the collection similarly in another letter, and even elaborated on the meaning of the phrase "other ancient Egyptian writings" as follows. In connection with 2 of the 4 mummies were 2 rolls of papyrus, previously mentioned. I may add that 2 or 3 other small pieces of papyrus, with astronomical calculations, epitaphs, etc., were found with others of the mummies. The second variation on this argument is that a much longer scroll was witnessed in Nauvoo, not matching either of the existing relatively short scrolls. This oft-repeated claim is based on a single third-hand reminiscence. In 1968, Hugh Nibley reminisced hearing from his uncle Preston Nibley, who supposedly heard it from an adult Joseph F. Smith, who reportedly remembered seeing, as a small child, that an unrolled papyrus extended through 2 rooms of the mansion house in Nauvoo. As this matches neither the physical evidence nor any other eyewitness testimony from the time, it is pretty safe to consider this to be third-hand, exaggerated legend. Now let's look at the second general argument, that Smith translated the Book of Abraham from the Horus Scroll, but from a different section of the scroll which has since been lost. The answer to this is brief, as it has already been covered. The scroll-length evidence presented earlier eliminates this possibility. Remember, the maximum length of the missing core could not have been more than 56 centimeters. This had to contain the missing vignette, plus the 2.5 columns of lost Book of Breathings text, leaving no room for a separate text about Abraham. The third general explanation is that Joseph Smith didn't obtain the Book of Abraham by translating the papyri, but rather the scrolls merely inspired him to get a divine revelation, restoring an ancient record. This explanation, increasingly popular among Mormon apologists, is possible, but it has 2 major problems. The first one is that this explanation itself and its popularity is a tacit admission of the overwhelming strength of the foregoing evidence against translation presented in this video, as well as the weakness of the pro-translation apologetic arguments. The second is that it blatantly contradicts the claims of Joseph Smith himself, as well as the Book of Abraham itself and the Church's official position. Let's take a look at some of those claims. The following 10 quotes from History of the Church come mostly from Joseph Smith's own diary in 1835 and indicate translation from the papyri or the literal presence on the papyri of the words of Abraham and Joseph. You can pause the video and read them all if you would like. And don't forget one of the most important sources of all, the Book of Abraham itself, published in 1842 in the Times and Seasons. If you open to the Book of Abraham in the Mormon Scriptures, this is still the first thing you will see. The Book of Abraham, translated from the papyrus by Joseph Smith, a translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt. The writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus. Also, let's not forget that the Horus Scroll vignettes were canonized in the form of facsimiles right along with the Book of Abraham. The inspired revelation hypothesis cannot account very well for their inclusion by Smith in the published Abraham translation, nor their current status as Mormon canon. What is the official position of the Mormon Church on the Book of Abraham's origins? In the Guide to the Scriptures, a reference work published as an appendix in Official Mormon Scriptures, under the heading Abraham, it says, "The Book of Abraham, ancient records written by Abraham that came into the possession of the Church in 1835. The records and some mummies were discovered in Egyptian catacombs by Antonio Lobolo." In the Church's Sunday School Manual, Gospel Principles, most recently published in 2009, it says the following: "The Book of Abraham was translated by the prophet Joseph Smith from a papyrus scroll taken from the Egyptian catacombs." In other words, translation is the Church's official position. What about the content of the facsimiles and Joseph Smith's interpretations of them, published with the Book of Abraham? Smith's explanations of the facsimiles offer a more direct chance to test his translation of Egyptian hieroglyphics, in light of current scholarship on the facsimiles. The facsimiles themselves could be another lengthy presentation topic all of their own. Without presenting a thorough analysis of all three facsimiles, I will end by offering a brief sampling of hieroglyphics in facsimile 3. Joseph Smith's published explanations for a few of the hieroglyphics in the facsimile will be shown here on the left, while a translation of the same hieroglyphics from modern LDS Egyptologist Michael D. Rhodes will be shown on the right in yellow. Joseph Smith explained Figure 2 as King Pharaoh, whose name is given in the characters above his head. The actual translation of the characters above the figure's head is the Great Isis, Mother of the God. Joseph Smith explained Figure 4 as representing Prince of Pharaoh, King of Egypt, as written above the hand. The actual translation of these characters above the figure's hand is Ma'at, Lady of the West. Joseph Smith explained Figure 5 as representing Shulem, one of the king's principal waiters, as represented by the characters above his hand. The translation of these characters actually reads Osiris Horus, the Justified Forever. You'll notice, of course, that none of these explanations match what is actually written in the facsimile. Virtually nobody in America knew this in 1842, of course, as even scholars at that time barely knew how to decipher Egyptian writing. Today, however, scholars know quite a lot about the subject. This is just a brief sampling of the facsimile's explanations, but it's a fair representation of the quality of translation. Conclusions. Based on overwhelming and very clear evidence, Joseph Smith apparently believed the Horus Book of Breathings papyrus to contain the writings of Abraham. Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham directly from this papyrus and even included illustrations from the papyrus in his published version. The existing fragments in LDS Church archives, constituting a majority of the scroll, are the primary source for this translation. And finally, the Egyptian content of these papyri, now known, has no relation to Joseph Smith's published translation, nor to Abraham or his time period. This has been a basic overview of the Joseph Smith Papyri, their general contents, and their relationship to the Mormon Book of Abraham. There are many facets of the papyri that were not covered in this video, including many things relating to the facsimiles, their reconstruction, and Joseph Smith's explanations of them. If you would like more information on the Joseph Smith Papyri and the Book of Abraham, I invite you to visit MormonThink.com, a website by Mormons for Mormons, critically analyzing the evidence for Mormon beliefs.